The year was 1861, and America was racing toward a storm it could no longer avoid. A storm born from decades of conflict, ambition, fear, and the unspoken truth that a nation built on the promise of freedom was still chained by the weight of slavery. To understand how the United States reached the point where Americans were willing to fight and die against each other, we must step back into a world divided long before the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter. In the early 1800s, the North and South were like two different countries hiding under one flag. The North pushed forward with factories, machines, and booming cities, filled with immigrants who believed in opportunity through hard work. Steam engines roared across railroads, telegraphs clicked endlessly, and industries rose like steel giants across the landscape. Meanwhile, the South lived under a very different sky. Wide cotton fields stretching endlessly, plantations built on forced labor, and an economy tied to slavery so deeply that many Southern leaders believed the institution was their birthright. As cotton became the gold of the South, slavery became the chain that held millions of people captive, and the moral divide that drove the nation toward collapse. For years, politicians tried to balance this growing tension with compromises. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But every agreement only delayed the inevitable. Every compromise was like patching a leaking ship while the water kept rising. Then came 1860, a year that changed everything. Abraham Lincoln, a tall, determined lawyer from Illinois who believed slavery was morally wrong, won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote. To the South, this felt like the beginning of the end, a sign that the North would use its growing power to destroy their way of life. Within weeks, Southern leaders held emergency meetings, debating whether to accept Lincoln or leave the Union entirely. One by one, states began to break away. South Carolina first, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These states formed a new country, the Confederate States of America, with their own president, their own government, and their own army. America was now two nations standing on the same land, staring at each other through smoke and fear. Lincoln tried to calm the crisis in his inaugural address, telling the South he had no intention of abolishing slavery where it already existed. But he also made one thing clear: the Union was permanent and secession was illegal. In simple words, he told the South, "You cannot leave." But the South believed otherwise. To them, the time for negotiation had passed. They saw themselves as heirs to the American Revolution, fighting for independence against a government they believed had turned against them. But beneath all political reasoning, beneath the speeches and declarations, one truth stood taller than any flag. This war was about slavery. The final spark ignited at Fort Sumter, a federal fort located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Confederate leaders demanded that Union soldiers inside the fort surrender. Lincoln refused. The Confederates opened fire at dawn on April 12, 1861, cannons thundering across the water as smoke swallowed the sky. The Civil War had begun. The news spread like wildfire. In the North, crowds filled the streets, cheering as Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to defend the Union men lined up at recruiting offices, eager to fight for a cause they believed was bigger than themselves. In the South, thousands enlisted as well, ready to defend their homeland against what they saw as a Northern aggression brothers who once ate at the same table now wore different uniforms. Families whispered goodbye to sons they might never see again. The Union Army, though larger and richer in industry, was unprepared for a long war. Many soldiers carried outdated weapons, marched with little training, and believed the conflict would be over in weeks. Some even joked that the war would end before the ink on their enlistment papers dried. But the South had advantages of its own. Brilliant generals like Robert E. Lee, familiar terrain, and soldiers motivated by a deep sense of duty to protect their homes. As both sides mobilized, tension spread across the nation like a shadow. Every American knew the country was standing on the edge of something terrifying. A war that would redefine freedom, reshape identity, and test whether the United States could survive its own contradictions. The first major test came at the First Battle of Bull Run, where civilians from Washington rode out in carriages to watch, believing it would be a quick and glorious Union victory. But when Confederate reinforcements arrived under the command of Stonewall Jackson, the Union lines broke. Panic surged, soldiers fled, and the North realized this war would not be easy. What began as a political dispute had now become a brutal struggle for the soul of America. As months passed, Lincoln wrestled with heavy decisions. He wanted to end the war quickly, but he also knew the conflict was tied to something far deeper than secession. Slavery stood at the heart of everything. The South fought to preserve it. The North fought to stop the nation from splitting apart. But Lincoln began to see a truth that would define the rest of the war. The Union could not be saved without destroying the institution that divided it. By the end of 1861, America was fully engulfed in war. Cities buzzed with fear and hope. Newspapers printed casualty lists that broke hearts across the nation. The sound of marching boots echoed through towns, and yet, despite the suffering and uncertainty, one belief held strong on both sides: that history was watching, and the future of America would be rewritten by the battles to come. The Civil War was no longer just a conflict between states. It had become a story of human struggle, sacrifice, freedom, identity, and the painful rebirth of a nation that had long refused to face its own contradictions. As 1861 closed, the war had only begun. The bloodiest years still lay ahead. The battles of Antietam, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and countless others would reshape the land and the people forever. But at that moment, in the early days of the conflict, Americans on both sides felt the same heavy truth. This war would decide not just who ruled, but who they were. It would define what the United States meant, what freedom truly meant, and whether a country built on the words, "all men are created equal," would finally confront the painful reality that not all were treated as such. And so, as soldiers set up camps under cold winter skies, as families prayed for their sons, and as leaders planned strategies that would send thousands to their fate, one thing was clear: the Civil War was not just a battle on fields. It was a battle for the identity of America itself, a fight that would tear the nation apart and piece it back together into something new. A war that began with cannon fire at Fort Sumter and would not end until freedom was redefined, unity was reborn, and the United States emerged forever changed.